to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Fire Plays No Favorites, Managing Wildland Fuels, Restoration, and Land Stewardship on a Changing Climate. My name is Lissa Strohecker. I'm with the Maui Invasive Species Committee. Joining me today to help with questions, Haley Misk as well. And I'm excited to introduce our featured speaker, Jordan Jokiel. Jordan is the Vice President and Land Manager for Haleakalā Ranch, where he oversees the company's conservation, invasive species, and forestry programs. With more than 20 years of experience in land and wildlife conservation, Jordan brings incredible expertise to today's discussion. He's had an impressive career in both conservation and land management, having worked as the Access and Acquisitions Program Coordinator for the state of Hawaii's Division of Forestry and Wildlife. He's also served as the former director of the Palmyra program for the Nature Conservancy of Hawaii and served as program manager for the East Maui Watershed Partnership. Jordan grew up in Kaneohe and graduated from the University of Hawaii at Manoa with a degree in environmental studies. Today, Jordan will share the important lessons he learned from the 2023 and 2024 wildfires and explore what those mean for stewardship of Haleakalā Ranch lands moving forward. We'll have time at the end for questions and answers, so thank you very much and mahalo for being with us today. Let's get started.
Yeah, well, Lissa is pulling this up. Okay, looks like the map is up. Yeah, so thank you first and foremost. I'm very, very honored and feel privileged to be here. You know, Lissa is an old friend and colleague. We've been working kind of together for a while in different capacities. So we were working an outreach event with a bunch of second graders last month, and she had just asked about, we started talking about the wildfires. And that led to the invitation to this webinar, and so, you know, I think what our hope is today at Haleakalā Ranch is just to kind of share some of our observations, our thoughts, and management approaches to managing invasive species. You know, fire has certainly been a very big and hot topic for all of us, and so we'll get into that, and hopefully we have enough time to just talk about some of the other management approaches that we've taken on here at Haleakalā Ranch. So this first slide is just to orient folks. This is the island of Maui, obviously, and the red polygons are, that is Haleakalā Ranch. It's kind of in 4 disjunct pieces. It's very, there's a huge diversity of environments. It goes from Mauka to Makai. It goes from a high elevation climax rainforest to very arid and dry coastal windblown settings. We have a pretty significant wildland and ranchland urban interface, and that directly ties into our very serious concern about managing wildfire. Next slide. Okay, so this is a shot of the rainforest environment. So in 1983, close to 20% of Haleakalā Ranch's holdings, probably 15 to 20%, 5,200 acres was conveyed to the Nature Conservancy for management of the native forested watershed that basically supplies water to much of Maui. It is managed very effectively by the East Maui Watershed Partnership and its partners. You know, and most folks here on this webinar are familiar with this kind of NGO structure that really is a hui of public and private landowners. It's funded very well by the county, the state, and federal, and even private landowners. It is always a dance to get funding, but it's really nice having a collaborative approach to galvanize native forest and watershed protection on public and private land. So again, this is a shot of Kenai Valley looking Mauka up into Haleakalā crater. Next shot. Next slide. So there's also, obviously, you know, it's Haleakalā Ranch. It has a very long history that goes close to 150 years back in when it was first incorporated. So over 20,000 acres of the ranch is still actively grazed. So this is a shot of the parcel that we call Waiaupai and Manawai Nui. It is a beautiful landscape, and it's adjacent to the protected lands of Kaikinui Forest Reserve, Nakula Natural Air Reserve, and the protected lands in Kahiki Nui on Department of Hawaiian Home. So it's a really strategic place in terms of having a wise and responsible land stewardship practice in place. Next slide. So prior to me working on the ranch, you know, like they talked a little bit, Melissa did a really nice kind of generous introduction. I was just, you know, as someone who grew up in Hawaii, I was just following my heart, working on all these different islands. I mean, I changed jobs kind of a lot when I was young, and because I really wanted to see, you know, what Hawaii had. And I was very fortunate to work in settings like this. This is Waiho'i Valley, which is a huge hanging valley. It's like the size of Manoa Valley that most people don't even know about, that's above Hana. This stream, Waiho'i Stream, actually flows out just south of Hamoa Beach in Hana to a place people call sandbars, and it probably contributes to that. But these kinds of places were the places that I started my career, and I did most of my conservation work for a couple of decades. And 10 years ago, I was fortunate enough to land the job at Haleakalā Ranch. And Haleakalā Ranch was a partner for two watershed partnerships that I had been working for, the East Maui Watershed Partnership and the Leeward Haleakalā Watershed Restoration Partnership. Next slide. And so it was nice. It came at a time in my life where I was looking for things that were different personally and professionally, like ways to grow and build upon whatever, you know, knowledge that I had and experiences and people and communities. And I was really fortunate to end up at Haleakalā Ranch. Like, I didn't know, I don't come from a livestock background. You know, I didn't grow up on a ranch, and I didn't honestly know what happens on ranches and how land is managed. But I did come to learn, you know, how in terms of conservation and land stewardship, the role that a well-managed herd can play in stewarding land. Like, I didn't understand that. And I think what we tend to do, and I get it, in the conservation community, it's the way I was brought up, is, you know, animals are bad because they're not part of the native biota. And, you know, they are bad in places, but where they can be utilized as a tool, like there's really no other tool that I found that you can manage large tracts of land if you have a well-managed livestock herd in the right setting with the right people. Again, like any operation in any enterprise, including conservation work, you know, it really depends on how well it's run. In and of itself, what's really important is how it's run. In and of itself, it might not be a good tool, conservation or anything, if you don't manage it well. Next slide. So what I learned from these folks that are generations deep working on this piece of land is, you know, there is a way to integrate the ranch's livestock and land management programs, and it actually is fundamental to the way we steward land. I put in this shot. The second guy from the left is Greg Friel. I've learned so much from his quiet wisdom. He's been the livestock manager here for 30 years, or pretty close to 30 years. But I think what's also important about this image is, so his son is to your left, his right. His name is Cody. And Cody's daughter also helps with a lot of our livestock operations and moving cattle. And it's so nice to see that continuity and that commitment and that understanding of the land by the people that work on land, like ranches like Haleakalā and other ranches, Ulupalakua, Ka'onaulu. These people have been around for a long time. And with them, there is this generational knowledge and understanding, and certainly commitment and passion about how they manage land. This by no means is just a job to these guys. And it's so nice it's actually humbling to be around people like that and to learn, you know, how they manage land, because it is a different land. It's very different from what I was brought up in working in those backcountry areas. Next slide. Yeah, and so in a nutshell, what I just learned is how the grazing program can really help to hold large tracts of land open, relatively free of really noxious weeds. You know, these are non-native grasses you're seeing, but they're not problematic if they're managed really well. It's a really high value feed, but also in the context of wildfire, it really manages and creates a defensible fire-wise landscape. It is very challenging for a fire to vector across this landscape, and we're going to get into that with the next couple of images. Next slide. So in August of 2023, that was just a crazy day for all of us. We got a call. Everyone was all hands on the ranch, responded at around midnight to a fire that started up in Olinda. That's Mauka of it's up in our mountain, adjacent to our mountain pastures. There was apocalyptic winds that were probably, you know, well over 70 miles an hour, the gusts were. The fire started in very, very heavy timber. The embers were vectoring the fire down the gulch and to the adjacent landscapes wherever they could get foothold. And so we had to wait till sunrise before we could even respond to it. Next slide. So the winds were so strong. This is a shot of Lester. He's one of the many hands that showed up to help fight this fire. And we had a lot of people come out in Kokua from the community. But I guess the point of this image is, you know, we were so hamstrung with what assets we had to fight the fire. Again, the winds were so strong that the helicopters couldn't launch, so we had no water. So we were running around with literally 4-gallon backpack sprayers and hand tools to put out the fire where it was kind of vectoring across and onto the ranch. And again, this was right adjacent to the ranch. It was a crazy day so we were fighting fire all day. At around noon, we looked to our south and the Kula fire erupted right around noon. We didn't know what that was. It turned into another catastrophic fire. And right at sunset, another fire erupted out in Puʻu in the Central Valley. And, you know, we looked at each other right around sunset. You know, we're still running around fighting fire. And we're like, what's going on? Like, it felt like the world was falling apart. You know, we didn't even know. This is the same day that Lahaina burned, and we didn't even know it was on fire until it was gone. We were so busy fighting these fires. And what happened late in the day, the first day of this fire, is the wind switched like it does in the evening. And all of a sudden, the embers started blowing in earnest across a fire break that we had managed to put in with a D6. And I remember it was me, Cody Iokepa, and Mikey Abreu. And we were running around trying to put embers that were outflanking us behind us because they were getting into the pasture. Next slide. And so what happened was we looked at each other, and there's these other fires that are erupting around us. And we didn't know what to do, but we had to come off the line because the day was over. It was sunset. You can't safely fight fire in an environment like this in the dark. So we came off the line with this photos, but this photo is really important because what it demonstrates is we didn't know what we were going to wake up to the next day. All we knew is the wind switched and the embers flew far into the pasture. But what we woke up to and we came back out in the first light is this landscape held the fire. It contained it. You can see the fire to the right, the smoke. It didn't there was no fuel for it to burn into in the pastures. And so we came back and we didn't lose the ranch and we didn't lose Kula in very, very large part and basically really entirely to just, there was no fuel for the fire to burn across. It crept through this grass, but it was defensible because it moved at such a slow speed. Next slide. And I took this picture 2 days ago. This is 400 yards straight Makai of that last shot. You can see how the fire really was contained to the timber. The pasture grasses around both sides of that fire, none of that really burned too bad. It came out 50 yards or so at a very slow pace, and we were able to contain it and to suppress it and eventually extinguish it because it ran out of fuel. So it just really showed me and others here, like that value of having this fire-wise landscape by having an actively managed graze environment that has low fuels. Next slide. So 11 months almost to the day, there was another fire. This was in July of 2024. And next slide. This fire burned in area that we call the Puʻu Reserve. It's delineated by these black lines. Those are fences. 1,200 acres of basically of pasture that we had taken out of grazing 25 years ago to protect the native forested subalpine shrubland. Is a strategic location because it's adjacent to Haleakalā National Park and what is now Kamehamehanui Forest Reserve to the south and Waikamoi Preserve to the north. Next slide. Well, time goes fast, yeah, when you're doing this. I'm looking at the clock. Anyway, this is what we were well on our way to a very successful project. You know, the native vegetation thrived. This is a really healthy mosaic of Ohelo, Pukeave, Mamane, A'ali'i, and you know, it's this multi-layered contiguous vegetation. Next slide. Unfortunately, that is also a really high fuel load. And that red footprint is what happened in about 36 hours. 600 acres of that super high value native forested shrubland burned in a day and a half. And the fire burned so hot and so fast that vegetation was not just flashy, like grass is flashy, but it held heat because it had light, it had wood in it, like Ohelo, Pukeave, those who know that, it burns like everything when you build a fire. It's all of that kindling that burns fast and hot, and it burned, so not just fast, but also really hot, and it took everything in its path. Next slide. So we woke up in the morning, again, we watched the fire burn all night. We couldn't do anything, we responded. This is when we came up to the line, me and Greg Friel came up and we looked at this, and what's remarkable about this photo, to the right is the restoration project that completely burned 600 acres. That was that beautiful mosaic of native subalpine shrubland, but the fire stopped. This is before a drop of water had been put on the fire, right where our pastures were grazed. Like right, like a straight line, a ruler's edge. Again, there was not a drop of water. Next slide. You know, and this is the one that really gets my attention, is it really shows the fire followed the fuel around a corner. It didn't burn through the grazed area. It went right around the corner. So next slide. And so at the same time, I put this slide in because at the same time that this happened, there was this conversation in the wake of the Lahaina fires that, you know, the invasive grasses are bad. And it really, you know, what's key, I think, what came clear to me was it's not the species of the grass, the biogeography of what the plant is fuel. And the key is to manage it. You know, this is a shot of those, after the fire, I went out into this burned landscape and I found 24 iliahi trees that are endemic to Maui. 22 of those are probably going to die. And everything else around it is basically, if the fire went through it, it died. And there's very slow recovery. That's actually coming back right now. And I think what I want to try to convey is that, you know, there's common ground, I think, that we as conservationists and we as livestock and rangeland managers have in common. Wildfire is one of those opportunities where we can, I think, find some middle ground to reduce fuels and be aware that you know, managing land to prevent wildfire is super, super important. I've only got 10 more minutes, but I'm going to take 5 minutes to talk about other ways we utilize livestock. Next slide. To manage invasive species. This is another project. It's 100 acres. It's at the boundary of Waikamoi Preserve in our wettest, most windward pasture. We utilize grazing. Next slide. We utilize grazing actually to reduce the vegetation in here rather than just spraying it with 2% Roundup and planting trees. We grazed it. We did a pilot project. We brought these animals in. Next slide. And next slide. So this is a cow grazing ginger. And here's a before and after. So the cattle would come in, they'd graze the above ground biomass of the ginger, and then we were able to go through. Anyone who controls ginger knows you have to take the ginger biomass off before you can apply escort to the rhizome, and it's a tremendous amount of work to remove that much biomass. But if you can utilize livestock to do that, next slide, without too much non-target damage, then I think you're onto something, because you have a tool that converts this invasive species or this weed to a marketable protein. Of course, there's a concern with non-target damage to native species. So I went around and I flagged native, in this case, ohia, and a bunch of other species at different size classes to see what that damage would be. And you can see on the left, there, it was totally browsed, this ohia tree with the blue flag. And on the right side, it totally recovered because it didn't take the root. And this is what happened to most of the native species in most of the size classes. And it helps inform, how we can use livestock as a management tool, even in our restoration efforts, unrelated to fire, rather than spraying herbicide and Roundup and everything else. And that has its place, but maybe we can get away from that. We can keep cowboys on the land with work and convert, what has been problematic. We used to think of it as that as marketable protein and sell that as grass finished beef. Next slide. Yeah, and this is what it looks like. After we grazed it, we planted 1,000 koa trees on 25 acres. I took this shot a couple of months ago, and that's what this landscape looks like now. Very last couple of slides. Could you actually go to the very last slide? Or the second to the last slide, I'm sorry. It's with cages. There's a bunch of cages that are empty. Yeah, that one. So this is just our silvopastoral approach to reforesting land and trying to develop a commercial forestry enterprise, is to integrate a low density planting of high value native koa trees to get all the ecosystem services out of those trees, and maybe hopefully a financial return in 50 or 60 years, but to integrate it at a low density like this, using cattle to graze the lands in between the cages. We're gonna have koa trees in each one of these cages. We're already doing that in a firewise landscape. Okay, last slide. So these are just some of the lessons learned. I think the most important ones for me are, collaborating with partners where we do have common ground. We oftentimes demonize each other, I think, and don't work as well with each other as we could, with the ag community and the conservation community. There's a lot of common ground that we have. I do think well-managed grazing operations can convert marketable fuel into marketable protein and provide meaningful work. And integrating multiple enterprises on a parcel of land does provide a lot of opportunities for conservation and for agricultural production. I apologize, that felt a bit rushed, but there's so much that we want to share with you guys. And, I welcome any conversations, but more than that, meaningful conversations, whether we're hanging out, something other, than just formal convention settings, just manager to manager conversations, I think are really important. With that, I guess I'll turn it over to you, Lissa, if there's any time or any interest for questions.
Thank you, Jordan. That was excellent. Yes, I really appreciate your perspective and the challenges, because, we're definitely in a changed landscape and it's a changed reality for land management. I think Haley's going to help me field some of the questions. So if anyone has any, feel free to put them in the Q&A.
I see a first question here in the chat from Abraham. Thank you so much for your question. For Jordan, what is the rainfall in these landscape areas?
So the rainfall in the place that burned, the native subalpine shrubland, is probably 30 to 35 inches a year, maybe less than that. The rainfall in the project where you saw the goats entering into the fence, into the project area, is much higher because it's decidedly windward. That's 55 to 60 inches at least per year. And I can get you a better figure on that, where that fire was. It's actually probably less than 30 inches.
Awesome, thank you. And then another one, are there any water holes or ponds on those landscapes?
There's not. There's some ponded water after really heavy rainfall events, but there's not in the environments that you guys were just shown. So one thing that's really important for us that we're trying to develop is water storage high on the mountain. So we have big water storage tanks, and we realized we were water limited with the Crater Road fire, that second fire I showed you, because that took place above 6,000 feet. It's really hard to get water that high up on the mountain, and there are no standing water holes. So we're trying to get more storage really up high, and we're looking in a number of different places to try to develop that capacity.
Awesome, thank you. And then we have a question from Nani. Thank you. If well-managed cattle can be beneficial, can't managed game animals serve as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have a personal opinion on that. Is if you have, and this is just my personal opinion after working in a lot of these places, is if you have the ability to manage the number of even wild animals like easily and confidently, I do think, and this is not what I thought for the vast majority of my career, but I do think there is a role that they play in reducing fuels, but it's with the very strong and key important caveat that you have to be able to manage their numbers easily, quickly, and confidently. So we call that stocking density. With our cattle, I mean, they manage stocking density by moving animals from one place to another, but wild feral animals aren't easy to move like that at all. They're wild. And that's something that only has, I just had a conversation with another guy about this literally 2 days ago. It's not easy. I don't even know if it's possible, but it's something that has recently, it's been really interesting to think about that, because when you don't manage fuels and you get a fire, you lose everything like we did. You can lose everything, not in every environment. Again, Pahu Reserve was in a dry environment with dry vegetation. And that's where you get a catastrophic loss. In the rainforest, I wouldn't worry so much about, obviously, catastrophic wildfires. So it depends on your setting. It depends on so many different things. So I'm not going to say, yes, that's a great idea, but, it's definitely something that is thought-provoking and would be interesting to better understand.
Thank you. And then we have another question from Kristen. Was the browsed ohia, was that from goats or cattle or both?
I think that was from goats. So there was a wide range. I watched a goat. It was kind of painful to do this. Walk a koa tree down over the course of I didn't intervene at all. I watched this because the idea with this project is it's a pilot project, right? It's only 100 acres, but hopefully that we learn lessons and we refine a practice. If there is a practice we can refine by using livestock to do restoration work and prep a site for outplanting. So I didn't want to intervene. I watched a goat walk down a koa tree in about 45 minutes. That ohia tree, I think, was browsed by probably a combination of goats and sheep. But the thing was that, and one thing that I've learned by moving from conservation, like restoration work, to agricultural work, is in conservation, a lot of it is, as hard as it is the most important thing is with what you plant, it has to live. In agricultural production, it has to perform. And so just about everything that was browsed in the Ukulele project site where the goats went in, including that ohia tree, it lived. It could still fulfill its ecological role once we took those animals out and planted the trees. So the plan with that area is we browsed the area. There was that non-target damage. Most of that, the very vast majority of it did recover. Now we've planted overstory trees. We're gonna let that rest for like 10 years. And we're going to bring animals back in when those trees are less vulnerable to grazing because they're bigger. And we're going to graze it again. And then we're going to hopefully start to plant the understory because the understory is inherently vulnerable to grazing pressure. But some of these other trees like ohia and koa, they're far less vulnerable. It's a bit of a long answer, but I think it was a really good question because that was really the lesson is like, what is what is the benefit of using livestock, and what is the potential consequence of non-target damage? And most of that stuff came back really well. I don't know if that helps. Glad to talk to you offline about that. I'd like to learn from anyone else on this, what their experience is with any of this stuff, because again, we're all learning.
Yes, I do have a question in the Q&A waiting that might get to that. It says from James, thank you, James. The Mana Road fire on Hawaii Island burned about 40,000 acres, mostly of kikuyu grass pasture, moving from the wet site to the dry side, the wet side to the dry side of the island. Can you speculate as to why the wildfires didn't burn your pastures, but did burn the pastures on the Big Island?
I can't, I don't know that setting. I think that's a question that managers at those sites should I guess be asked. I don't want to answer for them. But my one question to you is, was that kikuyu grass or was that fountain grass? Because they have the same genus, but they are remarkably different plants. Fountain grass, which is the first thing you see when you land in Kona, and most of what you see when you are in Kona, is not a super high value feed, not like kikuyu. But again, I don't think it's fair that I even try to answer that question.
Okay, I'll move on to Emily from the chat. Asked, do those native forested areas have greater water infiltration and retention than the grazed grassy areas? If so, could that help mitigate lower intensity fires?
I'm sorry, could you ask that again? I was reading something in the chat while you asked.
Yep, no worries. Do those native forested areas have greater water infiltration and retention than the grazed grassy areas? If so, could that help mitigate lower intensity fires?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to, we put out a paper. There was a group of us that were addressing some of the ecosystem services that were provided by rangelands, and there is a section on watershed value. So I'd have to revisit that. But I do think, what we see in kikuyu grass is there's on our soils, and again, it differs from place to place, is there's very high infiltration. The key is to keep the soil armored, to have vegetation on the land. And in this case, over thousands of acres, we have, a kikuyu and sweet vernal grass dominant cover, and we have soil that's most of it isn't really high clay, and we get really good water infiltration. So I guess it would depend on the site, and I should probably revisit that write-up before I answer that, or maybe even refer the person who managed that section to you.
Awesome. And then another question from Abraham. Thank you. Is it possible to have a mixed forest along the entire boundary?
The entire boundary of, maybe, could you clarify which boundary, and mixed of what type of mix, I suppose?
Yep. Okay, we'll wait for him to respond to that. He did ask another question in the chat. He's saying large porous rocks pulls morning dew from the air. Are there any rocks in the area that would keep moisture in the ground?
There's rocks, yeah. I mean, in our pastures, there's, where there's exposed soil, and even where there's grass, there's lots of rocks. Up high, there is where that burn was on Crater Road. There's a lot of rocks and rocky landscape up in there. So I imagine they play some role with that. What we're trying to do with the caged koa setting, and again, I had to rush through that. I could talk all day about that, maybe at another webinar, just if someone wants to talk about it. But we're putting trees at a density of 5 koa trees per acre, and our hope and our intention is, we'll be able to harvest those koa trees, because they're really cloud forest trees and not rainforest trees. We'll be able to harvest some of that essentially fog drip and bring it to the localized environment, and that will bring more water to the environment. But there's a whole balance to that too, because koa trees also use more water. So, there's a lot to that. Okay.
Awesome, thank you. And that was it for questions. Abraham did respond talking about the boundary. along the areas that are in need to bring rain into to keep the moisture in the ground from that mixed forest question above. But then beyond that, looks like we don't have any more questions.
Yeah, and I'm glad to continue this conversation, one-on-one or offline, with anyone who is interested. Because, I do think it's always important to stick to the fundamentals of our work that we know works, but always to try to move the compass in a direction that makes us better at what we do. And, just so we can improve, we can always improve our land practices. The world can be a really challenging place. Our environment is, there's a lot of threats to the land that we all manage, and it's important that we always are trying to learn more from each other and get better at what we do.
Thank you, Jordan. I really appreciate your time and your input, and yeah, to echo that, I mean, it's like we don't always have the answers. It's always learning from what we're finding in the environment and taking that in and changing our practices as we go forward. Okay, there was a few requests for Jordan's contact information.
You can give them, maybe my email is probably the best.
Okay.
And you have that, yeah, I think, Lissa?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me put that in the chat.
Okay.
Stop our share here.
And again, there was a lot of information that was just presented to you folks. Any one of those fire events or projects, we could talk for hours about it. And I think, so hopefully, it was somewhat informative, but I mean, there is a lot to talk about. And yeah, I do look forward to having those conversations with anyone who is kind of genuinely interested in trying to move these issues forward and understand them, because I want to understand it more for myself as well.
Awesome, thank you. You'll also be, I'm just gonna make a quick plug because we're gonna do an invasive pest meeting on Maui, August 12th and 13th. For anybody in this audience who's interested, it's put on by CTAR, MISC is co-sponsoring it, and we've invited Jordan to present again. So, questions, feel free. Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.